Bird flight is one of those topics that seems really intuitive at first, but the more you dive into it, the more you realize it's actually not. I first started studying this a couple months ago when I chose it as a topic for my research paper that I had due. And the more I dove into it, the more complex and intricate it got. So today, I'm going to be sharing with you what I learned and how a bird flies, but also I'm going to be doing it in a way that anyone should be able to understand, so that by the end of this video, you will fully know how a bird is able to fly. So without further ado, this is Mechanics of Bird Flight, and let's fly right into it. So this video is going to be broken up into 4 different sections, and the first one is the 4 fundamental forces of flight, which are lift, thrust, drag, and weight. The first one is lift. Lift is what keeps the bird in the air, and that's what raises the bird and keeps it floating. And this is created by the shape of their wing, which if you were to look at a cross-section of a bird's wing, it would make an airfoil. Now, because of the Coanda effect, when the air hits the wing, the air flows over the top of the wing faster than underneath. Because of the round surface, the air gets catapulted over it. Now, Bernoulli's principle states that faster moving air creates an area of low pressure. So, the air that's moving faster over the top of the wing creates an area of low pressure, and the air moving under the wing is moving slower and creates an area of high pressure. So that high pressure pushes up and lifts the wing because there's a lower pressure on top. So that's how birds create lift. But it's also not just that, they also angle their wings, kind of like when you're riding in the car and you stick your hand out the window and you angle it up or down, you can feel your hand moving up and down like that. Birds will do the exact same thing with their wings. They'll angle it up or down in order to control how the air flows. Because Newton's third law of motion states that for every reaction, there's an equal and opposite reaction. So, when that air is going over the top of the wing and gets flung down because the wing is angled up, that air going down pushes the bird up as well. So it's not just one force, it's a whole bunch of things that work together to keep the bird up in the air. Now the second force is thrust. This is what allows the bird to even get as far as making the lift. And thrust is basically the bird's movement forward, because in order to get air to flow over the wings, you need to be moving, or you need to have a strong headwind. So in order for a bird to make that thrust, they have to be able to flap and move themselves forward. Now normally, when you think of birds flapping, you think of it as up and down, which is not how it is. It's down and back. Same thing, Newton's third law of motion. For every reaction, there's an equal and opposite reaction. The bird is pushing the air down and back, which pushes it up and forward because of Newton's third law of motion. So that is how the thrust works in simple terms. Now, drag is trying to prevent the bird from being able to move forward, which means they have to make enough thrust to be able to overcome the drag and move forward. And the bird's weight is working against it as well, because gravity is trying to pull the bird down, which means that the bird has to make enough lift to be able to combat gravity and its weight. So those are the 4 fundamental forces of flight, and now we're going to go on to a little bit more of a complex topic, which is wing loading and aspect ratio. Now, wing loading is basically the difference between the bird's weight and how much lift it can make. So, to put it in simple terms, if you have a loon, a common loon, like this picture right here, they are a really heavy bird with small wings. They do not make a lot of lift when they are flying. Now, because of this, if they were missing just a couple feathers, they would almost not be able to fly. This means that they have a high wing loading. A high wing loading means that it is really hard for them to fly. So birds with high wing loadings either have a hard time doing it or cannot fly, like a penguin or an ostrich. Now, a bird with a low wing loading, like a red-tailed hawk, like this picture, they make a lot of lift with their wings, and they're really light birds. This means that it is relatively easy for them to fly. So, they have a low wing loading. Basically, just remember this. High wing loading, harder to fly. Low wing loading, easier to fly. Now, aspect ratio is basically the shape of the wing. Like seabirds usually have a high aspect ratio wing. This means they have long, thin wings, which allows them to generate a lot of lift, which means that they can soar over the water without having to flap a lot. Now, birds with slotted wings, like a lot of birds of prey, you'll see if you look up, you can kind of see like fingers on the ends of the wings. That helps regulate lift and generate more lift because it helps control how the air flows over the wing. This allows them to fly up high, and it also helps them generate a lot of lift. They usually have a little bit wider wings as well. And then you have high-speed wings, like falcons and swifts and plovers, and these are more pointed, and they're not as long as a high aspect ratio wing. And this allows them to be extremely maneuverable and be able to fly extremely fast. And then you have classic elliptical wings, which is like your blue jay or your woodpecker, so it's just a classic wing shape. And this allows them to be able to fly through the woods and be able to land, and it doesn't generate a lot of lift, which is why they flap a lot, but it's perfectly suited for the terrain that they live in. And then you have game bird elliptical, which is basically the same thing, although it's a little bit more rounded, and this is for like turkeys and grouse and chickens. And this wing shape is really good for getting off the ground really fast and getting out of a predator's way, because these birds mostly live on the ground. Now, they can't really fly that far easily because of the shape of the wing, but allows them to get a boost of speed and get out of there if there's an emergency. So that is wing loading and the aspect ratio, but the next one leaves from more of like shapes and physics and stuff like that, and goes into more of how a bird's body is actually designed. So this section is going to be about the body of a bird. So, as you probably know, most of a bird's bones are hollow, and this allows it to be extremely light. They also have little struts inside the bone that keep the bone from collapsing. Think of it as jacks holding up a building. Now, a lot of birds' bones are also fused together, like their back is fused into a hard, rigid plate, and the tips of their fingers are fused together, and this allows them to keep a straight back while flying, and it allows them to have a really strong anchor point for their flight feathers on the fingers. They have a really long, flexible neck, which allows them to preen, which keeps their feathers in tip-top shape. They also have a keel attached to the bottom of the rib cage. Kind of think of it as like a sailboat keel. And this stabilizes their flight, and it anchors their flight muscles, which will usually make up about 1/3 of a bird's body weight. Or, in pigeons, it makes up 40% of their body weight. Also, the wishbone helps the bird on the upstroke, because when they push down, it compresses the wishbone, which helps spring their wings back up. Which, by the way, when a bird is flapping, it goes down and back on the downstroke, but then on the upstroke, when it pulls its wings up, the primary feathers and secondary feathers separate and the wings fold in, which allows the air to flow through so there's less drag and they don't end up pushing themselves down, which is really interesting. And a bird's skeleton can be so light that a bird like a frigate bird, their skeleton is lighter than all of their feathers, which is crazy because feathers are extremely light, which is actually the next thing we're going to talk about. Feathers are made out of keratin, which is the same substance as your fingernails, and they are strong and flexible and light. And this is what allows the bird to actually fly, as well as giving them the feathers that are able to create the lift. And feathers have a main shaft with barbs running off the side, and those barbs are held together by barbels and barbicels. Pretty sure that's how you say it. And those are little hooks that hold the barbs together. And that's why you could run your finger along the opposite grain of the feather and then run it back, and most of the time it'll clip back together because it's almost like a zipper that holds the feather together. Also, birds have an extremely developed respiratory system that is unlike mammals and reptiles. A bird's respiratory system allows them to always have oxygen in their lungs at all times, which allows them to fly up high where we would die. Pun intended, but it is true. So how it works is they have air sacs, 9 of them, that are attached to the lungs. So when they breathe in on their first inhale, the air flows through the trachea and into the rear air sacs. Now, air that was previously in the lungs, that is now carbon dioxide, goes into the front air sacs. Now, on their exhale, the air that was just breathed in goes from the rear air sacs and goes into the lungs. Well, that old carbon dioxide that was in the front air sacs go out the mouth and into the wide world for the trees to turn it into more trees. And then on the second inhale, new air comes in and goes into the rear air sacs. Well, our first breath of air goes from the lungs, which is now carbon dioxide, and goes into the front air sacs. Then on the second exhale, our first breath of air goes out into the world, helps create trees, and that new breath of air that had just come in goes into the lungs and starts turning into carbon dioxide. So this cycle always means that there's oxygen in the lungs, which allows them to go places where humans would not be able to go without an air mask. Oxygen mask, it should be. And then now moving on from that, we're going to go into the different kinds of feathers and how they use that to control themselves. So birds have 4 main important sets of feathers. The first ones are the primaries. So if you put out your hand like this, the primaries are basically your fingers. Those are the ones on that outside edge right there. Those help steer the bird and control how the lift flows over the wings. And then the secondaries are the ones in between the primaries and the body. So that would be along your arm. Those are what generate most of the lift. So those ones are some of the most important feathers on the body. Now they also have a feather called the ulula. Pretty sure that's how you pronounce it. Think of that as your thumb. It's usually 2 to 3 feathers on the top of the wing, and this controls how the air flows over the secondaries, and it helps reduce turbulence, which helps steady their flight. So these ones are really small, and usually you would miss them, but they're also really, really important. The last set of feathers that are really important are the tail feathers, and this helps slow them down when they are going to land, and it can also help during takeoff because they will pump their tail up and down as basically kind of like a boost and propeller to gain speed, which helps them get the lift that they need. So those are the 4 main sets of feathers, and then the rest of the feathers, they all have their important parts, but in terms of flight, those are the 4 ones that help with flight the most. And then the rest of the feathers on the body are mostly for aerodynamicsy. That's not a word, is it? Mostly helps them for being aerodynamic and smooth and streamlined. So the bird will use these 4 sets of feathers to be able to control how they fly. They'll use their tail feathers by kind of doing this and tipping it back and forth to steer. Some birds will flap one wing faster than the other to help turn themselves. Tip yourself, bring one wing in. There's a lot of different ways that birds control their flight, but it all usually happens within those 4 sets of feathers. So now you know how a bird can fly, and now you have all that juicy knowledge that you can go share with your friends and impress them with your understanding of a bird. And that also kind of explains why most chickens can't fly. They're more in the family of a game bird. So even chickens that can kind of fly, like Frightful, rest in peace, have more of the wing shape and body build of, say, a turkey. And even turkeys and grouse and birds like that aren't built for flying far. So that can explain why chickens can't really fly that well. And also they've been selectively bred, so they're a lot heavier than their wild game bird relatives. But now you know how a bird can fly. And yeah, thank you so much for watching. We're going to be putting videos out about once a month. So yeah, this is the Clucking Awesome YouTube channel, and we shall see you next time.